The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is such an interesting property, with so many incarnations over the years. Every fan has their own different shows, movies, or comics, or games that got them into the universe. I remember watching a bit of the 80s show on VHS tapes, and I did catch the 1990 film on TV once as a kid, which was pretty mind-blowing to see. But the biggest thing for me was the 2003 show. Me and my sister and many of our friends went nuts for this series. It felt so dark and edgy and cool, while still having the fun and unique heart that the franchise has as its core. It's a bit closer to the comic book original, but still with less blood and gore. That theme song goes so hard, it's great. It's really goofy and fun, and it just feels very early 2000s. The only Ninja Turtles game I ever played as a kid was based on the 2007 CGI movie, and like the film, I thought it was pretty decent. A bit later I played and loved Turtles in Time, but I wanted to know what the games based off the 03 show were like, so I decided to give them all a shot, starting with the game just called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, both developed and published by Konami, back when they didn't suck like they do now. The game starts with the show's intro, and actually uses the show's animation as cutscenes, making you play out the episodes. It's not a bad idea. It might come across as lazy to some, but I think it works well. There are some in-game cutscenes, but they're pretty short and simple. This is a 3D beat-em-up where you play as any of the 4 turtles going through missions. You have a light attack, heavy attack, projectile attacks too, which are limited to the amount of shurikens you have. You pick up more as you go. You have an uppercut style move that knock enemies into the air, and then you can juggle them, which is really satisfying to do. You can also dash and jump. It feels very nice and smooth. The combat's honestly just really fantastic. It's very simple, but it just feels great. The game does a decent job replicating the show's visuals, though up close the characters look a little bit off. I do like that they gave Mikey's default expression like a slight smile. I just thought that's fun. And it's great to hear the voice cast returning for their roles. Also gotta give a shout out to the soundtrack. Whoever's playing guitar on this track is fucking shredding it. It feels very in tune with the show. I love the comic style effects that the game has in combat. For some reason you can turn them off, which I thought was funny. That actually is a feature in later games too. I don't know why you would want to turn them off, but it's a thing. The whole game is also playable in 2-player mode, which is great because beat 'em ups are just so much more fun with friends. But it's a shame they couldn't make it 4-player. After all, the GameCube and Xbox have enough controller slots for it, and it just makes so much sense for a TMNT game. Of course, the PS2 only having 2 controller slots would still be limited. There's also some fun destructible elements like fire hydrants or exploding barrels. You can also find health pickups like soda and pizza and other food items. There's also temporary buffs inside crates and stuff. As you get further into the game, you unlock new moves, like attacking in midair. The stages are a bit long, but having a decent amount of moves makes the combat fairly satisfying, which is pretty important for beat 'em ups. To me, a good beat 'em up should feel like a simplified fighting game, with the way you string together moves and have a bunch of different ways to deal with enemies. You also have a limited amount of lives. You start with 6, and if you lose all of them, you gotta redo the chapter you're currently on. Your lives come back when you begin a new chapter, which usually comprises a handful of stages. It does make the game more intense for sure, because you might need to redo 10 to 15 minutes worth of gameplay if you get far before you game over. It does add a lot of tension to the game, but redoing so much stuff can be pretty rough, especially if you get to like the last boss on a chapter and you're unsure on like what to do when you get wrecked. It's fun to see them adapting episodes, especially one-off stories like the one called Nano. Spoilers for this episode, but I just gotta gush about it because it's one of my favorites. It's about this nanomachine swarm that gets loose, and it ends up finding some small-time thug named Harry, who he takes to as his father figure. Though this thug is really just abusing Nanobot's abilities for his own gain, and he doesn't treat him very well. But when he's cornered, Nanobot protects him and continues to make himself stronger to help him out. You can tell this robot is really just like a child, desperately wanting their parental figure to appreciate them. And eventually when the turtles try to trap the rampaging Nanobot, Harry tries to get him free, realizing how much Nanobot cares about him makes Harry want to rescue him, but instead he accidentally sends him to what seems to be his death, leaving Harry sobbing alone while the cops slowly surround him. This episode left such an impact on me as a kid. The sound design for the Nanobot is just so well done, and I love the use of classical, like theatrical masks to represent his emotions. It's just such a good story. Sorry, I just needed to gush about it. Seeing it represented in this game brought back so many memories. Anyways, back to the game. I also want to point out that while you can redo any mission if you've cleared it, you can only do so with a turtle that has already beaten it, and you don't unlock everything by beating the game once. So it really urges you to complete it 4 times, which this game is just a bit too repetitive for me to do, especially because the game has invisible walls everywhere, and they only clear up when you defeat all the enemies. And I mean, that's just something beat 'em ups do, and it would be fine, but the later stages, some sections just go on for so long. Enemies just keep spawning in, and you keep fighting, spawning in, fighting, spawning in, fighting, then you can finally move on. Also, these flying foot soldiers are so fucking annoying. I feel like I should be hitting them here, but I'm just not. It feels like you have to hit it at very specific points, and when there's multiple of them, some of them will fly up and temporarily trap you in this laser field, and others shoot you down, and you can try to dash out of it, but you'll most likely take some damage, and often they just knock you all around. These guys straight up suck to fight. They feel like unfinished enemies. To be fair though, I can imagine this game was probably made under a really tight deadline, and one thing I do think is really cool is that you get some unique cutscenes and fights when playing as different turtles, so there's a good reason to give the other characters a shot. There's also a challenge mode that adds some extra replay value to the game, as well as a versus mode where you can fight a CPU or a friend. It has some unlockable stages and characters, and while it does get old after a bit, it's a pretty decent game overall. If you love beat 'em ups, and especially if you got a friend to play them with, it's not a bad time. I wouldn't say it's a great game, but the core combat is really fun, and if it looks fun to you, I'd say it's definitely worth a shot. Let's see how the handheld port compares. It was released on the Game Boy Advance. Just like the main console game, it follows the show's plot well. I'm honestly really liking how the game looks. The shading is so nice and the world feels lived in. The character animations look good, the combat feels decent. After the first level, the next stage takes place during like a vehicle section, and you gotta shoot mousers coming at you. It's fine, I guess. It goes on a little longer than needed, but the visuals are impressive. This door at the end, man, it takes so long to shoot it down. It just feels like it goes on forever. There's also a section like this with a skateboard. It's a pretty simple beat 'em up, and there's nothing wrong with that. I appreciate the attempts at variety, but I don't feel like they worked out super well. I'd be really happy to have this as a kid. Next up, we have the sequel, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 Battle Nexus. One small thing I want to mention is that the second game has this beautifully illustrated cover, and I feel like the design of the whole thing is just a lot cooler. This game comes with the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arcade game as a bonus, though sadly the music and audio is replaced, so it's not the best way to experience the game, but I still think it's a really cool bonus. One immediate improvement is that you can have up to 4 players go at it at a time. Well, on GameCube and Xbox at least, not PS2 of course. But that's a great thing to see. In this game you can also select all turtles yourself and swap between them, which is a big improvement in my opinion. You don't have to play through the story one turtle at a time. Like the last game, this game uses clips from the show as cutscenes, but this time they also got new animation made just for this game. Going into the game, we're deep within the Foot Clan HQ. I think the cell shading has taken a huge step up. The game just looks more polished overall. The turtles look way better than in the last game. Their character models just don't look as awkward. I also like how the health bar is this circle around the turtle shell. It's a cute way to display it. So you can swap between the turtles whenever you want, but they do all have the same health bar, which is fair. There's also some switches and stuff to interact with in the environment, as well as a bit more focus on platforming. Like this wall jump is so nice. I really love it. It's so fucking satisfying. Sadly, you can no longer uppercut people to juggle them, which I thought was really fun in the last game. But you can block now, which is helpful. You can also throw enemies, and if you hold the heavy attack button, you do a charge move, which you can level up. Sadly, the automatic combo from the last game is gone. There, when you kept doing light attacks, it did a small combo. Here, the combo is just 2 attacks on repeat. It's way less satisfying. But thankfully, when you get further into the game, you unlock proper combos. But the problem is that to start out with, the combat is really rough and basic. I had to play for a bit until the combat started getting really fun. You also get other abilities like parrying as you get further in, but I just wish you started out with more combos. The turtles now need to work together a lot more using their special abilities. So Leo can cut down obstacles, Raph can move heavy objects, Donnie can hack terminals, and Mikey can hover short distances. I like this a lot. It means that if you're playing co-op, you're not just fighting together. You're also cooperating on tasks to progress. You also get ranks at the end, and the player that does the best gets MVP status. It's a cute way to add a little bit of competition. This game thankfully doesn't constantly block your way forward like the last game did. You see enemies in an area, you take them out, you move on. It just flows a lot better than the last one. I also appreciate that the enemies don't just appear out of a puff of smoke. I mean, it makes sense for the ninjas, but for thugs and mutants, it just felt a bit weird. Here they often have ways to show enemies coming into battle battle, whether it's an elevator or just a door. I appreciate that detail. In this game, when you die, you restart the level you're on. You only get one life, but you don't have to redo that much when you die. I think this is way better than the first game, and the stages don't last nearly as long. The pacing is just much better overall. You can also choose what levels to take on, so you got some more freedom on what you want to do and when. There's also some secret exits on some levels, leading you down alternate paths. There are also more in-game cutscenes here, and they look a lot better than the last game. The animations are much smoother looking. There's also some sections with different gameplay, kinda similar to the first Game Boy game, like this where I'm escaping a collapsing cave on this hoverboard type thing. The controls are really smooth and satisfying. I enjoy this section a lot. You don't have a health bar, which is very strange. It's more about collecting all these tokens that you see laying around. The more you get, the more like bonuses you get or something. But I don't know, something about the controls here is just really fun. I can imagine playing this with friends, trying to get the best score would be a pretty good time. After some teleportation shenanigans, we end up in an alien city, and we have to protect this robot guy named Fugitoid. He's being hunted by two large rival factions who are entangled in a huge interstellar war. In this mission, you gotta protect him. You gotta pick him up and carry him to the goal. You often have to stop and fight before you pick him up again. I could see this being fun in multiplayer, beating up people and protecting whoever is carrying Fugitoid, but playing solo, it's really fucking annoying. I'd rather have him just follow me instead of having to fight, pick him up, move, fight, and you carry him so slow too. And one time I got kinda far but accidentally hit this pipe that sprayed some liquid that damaged Fugitoid and killed him, so that was cool. At least this mission is short. I wouldn't mind this mission if it wasn't for one thing: it's fucking timed. You have to go fast, so when playing alone, this mission straight up sucks. It feels like it was specifically designed for multiplayer, but I do appreciate the variety here. The first game was just a pure beat 'em up, and I don't mind that at all. But this game has combat focused missions, boss missions, platform focused missions, hoverboard sections, spacecraft flying missions, and you have other missions like this one, where you're escaping this crazy looking alien trash disposal machine. It's pretty fun overall. I love how we go all over the place in this game. After the alien city, there's a prison break, being forced to fight a giant monster in a gladiator style arena, barely escaping with Fugitoid in an almost Star Fox-esque mission. Eventually Fugitoid makes a teleporter so that the turtles get back to Earth. Then we get shown a wacky VR machine made by the Utroms that let them experience the past, which is how we're shown how they landed here on Earth. We also face a feudal version of the Shredder and his Foot Clan. The areas look so great. I love the sunset location especially. So the VR machine basically glitches out and traps everyone in there, but eventually they break out by speaking to the Utroms of the past. Turns out Shredder is waiting though, and there's a really fun section where you have to dodge Shredder's attacks and throw the Utroms into the portal to send them to a safe place. Something about this mission is so goofy and fun to me. One stage I didn't really like much is 8-2. So in 8-1 and 8-2 you fight someone called the Ultimate Ninja. The first stage really isn't too bad. You just fight him and run away when he's on top of this truck. It's pretty exciting. The projectiles are a little hard to dodge, but it's not too bad. But the next stage, 8-2, is really frustrating to me because you start out on a bridge and these cars are going a million miles an hour, and it feels like luck whether you manage to jump over them or not. But at least when you get to fight the ninja himself, that part is pretty fun. I don't like that he randomly throws sleeping gas that makes you stand still for a bit. It's so sudden and hard to react to. But otherwise, it's a decently fun boss fight. Man, I love this dragon move he does. I just wish the bridge section was less annoying. The variety of bosses and enemies in general are so much better in this game, and it's a lot more fun because of it. And you don't have to deal with those stupid hover car foot guys anymore. Though there is one enemy that did get a bit of a downgrade. It's the foot soldiers with cloaking. In the first game you can still make them out even though they're mostly invisible. The effect looks cool. In the second game they are completely invisible and you can only see them by their shadow, which sometimes it feels a bit unfair when the shadow is like hidden behind crates or other things. I don't know why they removed that effect. One enemy I don't like much are the bat enemies or whatever. They're kind of hard to hit and they're often placed around platforms where they can knock you off. They're not nearly as bad as the foot soldiers in hover cars from the first game, but they're still pretty annoying and not that fun to fight. I was getting into such a groove playing stage after stage and fighting new and old bosses. I really was having a good time and the content kept on coming. I did hit a bit of a snag with level 11-3 though. Midway through the level there's this platforming section. It feels really finicky because the camera doesn't help help with the depth perception being so far away. There's a slight delay to jumps. It's fine when it comes to simple platforming, but right here it feels like this section was a little too complicated for what this control scheme is built for. Thankfully, it doesn't take much to get back to the spot if you game over, but it gave me a bit of trouble and I got pretty frustrated. But at least the boss fight at the end is really fun. I like fighting these elite ninja guys. So we get to the Shredder's new hideout. We fight Hun in a decent boss fight, Kurai in a really fun boss fight, and the Shredder himself at the end. This final fight was a blast. The bosses in this game are a good bit better than the first one. So we escape to see the ship explode, and that's the end of the game. Well, the main part of the game. You can also check out the artifacts you've collected and read what characters think about them. There's some fun conversations and stuff here too. And there's some concept art from the show and the game, as well as concept art for Ninja Turtles toys, which I thought was pretty cool. You can also compete in several different tournament modes, which unlock more content and characters. I'm sad that there's no more versus mode like in the last game. It's such a simple way to add some fun replay value to games like this. I mean, if we could have had a 4-player versus mode, I feel like that would have been a great time. So overall, as a sequel, I think this game is pretty good. The combat starts out a bit rough, but it gets fun the further in you get. Though I still think the combat was a bit better in the first game, it just felt a little smoother. The wall jumping is stupidly satisfying, even if the basic jump is decent at best. It's just a little too stiff. The characters look a lot better and the cutscenes are better animated. The game is like more than twice as long. It has a good variety of missions and locations. It has up to 4-player co-op instead of just 2. And having 1 life per mission is a lot more fun than having a limited life for several missions like the first game. It's just a much larger game and it's overall better than the first in my opinion. Now onto the handheld version. We start out with some voiceover by the Turtles explaining their situation. Pretty unusual to hear voice acting on a GBA game.
Our mission begins. Abducted by strange lights. Encounter with deadly enemies.
We get 3 modes here, story, race, and battle mode. Jumping into the story, you can tell they had to condense a lot of details. Here you start with the gang hanging out in the Turtles' lair, with the cutscenes being similar to the last GBA game, but this one goes on and on. I mean, holy shit, it takes so long to get to the gameplay. Once you get to the first stage, as expected, it plays like the game before it, but you start out not having your weapons and having to collect them. Once you get them, it's smooth sailing. The combat is okay and the platforming feels a bit better than the last game. So that's something. We then get to the hoverboard section, like in the console game. But in this game, it's more about combat than avoiding obstacles. And just like the home console version, I found these to be pretty fun. The controls are smooth, and it's a nice way to add some variety. As I keep playing, I don't like how I have to find the weapons again and again for every stage. It's really weird. You get objectives as you go, and the first one in every mission is always to find the weapons. Then you gotta find certain key cards with the eventual goal of getting out of there. I'm just not that keen on this mission style. They do this to make you use stealth at the beginning of a stage to get around enemies before you can fight them once you got those weapons. But I think making you do this over and over again is just really weird. The game also ends with the Turtles getting back to Earth once you have enough crystals to charge the teleporter. So you don't get any of the stuff with feudal Japan or the crazy showdown with Shredder or the Ultimate Ninja, so they had to condense a lot. As it stands, it's fine, but I prefer the first GBA game. It was just more simple and to the point, even if the platforming was a bit jank. Now this game I'm really curious about. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 Mutant Nightmare is yet another sequel, and I'm really hoping it can take the best elements of the 2 previous games and combine them. I'm glad to say the cover art sure delivers. It's really damn cool looking. Starting the game, we get a really well done CGI opening. Just like the second game, you can be up to 4 players at a time, which is just great. I'm a little sad I can't swap between the turtles, but at the same time, it's cool how the CPU players will now control the other turtles, so they're always walking around with you and fighting alongside you. The gameplay is similar to the last 2, though your dash ability has sadly been replaced with a dodge roll. It's not as cool because the dash attack in the previous game was an attack and it let you go a lot faster. It was fun for movement and fun for combat. This roll stops your forward movement completely once it's done. I didn't find it useful for dodging and I didn't like using it for movement. You can still block, but you can't throw in this game. You also can't do charge attacks anymore. Overall, the combat is a bit simpler. Thankfully, you don't need to unlock abilities to be able to pull off any combos, so that's a big improvement over the second game. You start out with a few combos and unlock even more options as you go on. There's a bunch of different scrolls you can use to enhance your abilities, and you can customize your moveset. There are also team attacks where you'll be prompted or prompt others to do a quick time event to unleash a powerful move. But the animation and sound design is really underwhelming, and I don't really find them satisfying to pull off at all. I do like that it adds some teamwork though. I will say I think the graphics have taken a slight step up since the second game. The second mission is a large area where you need to find 3 spaceships and destroy them. There's a lot of ground to cover. You can fight enemies along the way if you want, or just run there. While the second game did have some platforming or something along the way, here I'm just running around and it's pretty boring. I feel like you should be moving faster when the areas are this big and empty. They brought back the hoverboard mission, but it doesn't control nearly as smoothly as the last game. Here it feels super janky and stiff. You can fight enemies here, so it's not just about dodging obstacles or collecting stuff, but the combat is really fucking awkward. And whenever your characters make these turns, it feels so off every time. Not a fan of this at all. I feel like it's a huge downgrade from the second game. One minor thing I'm not a huge fan of is how your characters snap to the forward and backwards directions. So like walking side to side feels smooth, but once you walk forwards and backwards, you snap into place. It was sort of like this in the last game too, but I feel like it was so much more noticeable. I know it's not too unusual for games to do this, but here it just irks me. I feel like they increased the sensitivity to it. If you die in a mission, it's over, like the last game. There's a lot more 3D cutscenes in this game compared to the previous two, but I really don't like how they look here. The way the physics on their bandanas go fucking crazy just doesn't look very good, and their lip sync is kind of freakish. I felt these cutscenes in the last game felt really cinematic and fun. Both this game and the last had motion captured cutscenes, but here it just feels a lot more cheap. I know they had to do a lot of dialogue to condense the story for this game, but I just don't like how they look. After a quick run through the sewers, we come to a static shooter section. This is really lame. I mean, it just feels so lazy to me. I love me some variation, but this isn't exactly what I had in mind. It's so simple and boring. You can tell it's just padding for time with no thought or effort. You might think I'm being harsh, but there is 8 of these missions in the game. Like, come on. There's 2 variations of this mission style. One where you throw shurikens and you can block. One where you fire 2 types of lasers and can't block. Neither of them are fun nor interesting. This game removes the platforming completely, which I think is a bit of a shame. I'd rather see them improve the platforming of the last game. Them being ninjas and all, it just makes a lot of sense to have platforming. I really liked it for the most part in the second game. It was just that one stage I thought was annoying, but otherwise I really enjoyed it. Here it's closer to the first game's structure of very classic beat 'em up levels. But with this game's combat not being as good as the first, that makes this feel pretty boring in the long run. This game also has escort missions, just like the last game, but at least here they walk on their own. You don't need to carry them yourselves. You also have this glider section, which is just very boring. I really don't have much to say about it. The game also has challenge modes like the other games, and it has an arcade game built in, just like the previous game did. This time it's Turtles in Time, but the audio, again, is completely replaced with music from this game, and the dubbing is redone, and it sounds awful. It's a cool bonus, but the frame rate of the arcade version is cut in half here, so there's a lot of caveats to this port. This game does not have any unlockable characters. No tournament mode, no versus mode. Really, there isn't that much here, and what there is not that great. The hoverboard missions are worse than the last game. These stupid shooter missions are boring as hell. There's no interesting platforming, and the game is just so simple. This game might have the worst level design out of the 3 because there's almost nothing to say about it. And some missions here are over 10 minutes long, so they can really drag. While I did find myself getting more frustrated at certain sections in Battle Nexus, this game is just far more boring, and it never reached the fun that I managed to have with its predecessor. I'm sad to say it, but I just don't like this game. Hopefully the handheld port can surprise me. The first few games were on GBA, but this one is on the Nintendo DS. The pixel art seems to be mostly the same as the previous games, which isn't a bad thing at all. One immediate improvement is that with all the extra buttons that the DS has, we're given more moves to our arsenal. Light and heavy attacks feel really nice and satisfying, and you don't have to collect your weapons this time. I really like that you can call upon your brothers if you need help with obstacles or to pull off team attacks, just like the home console game. There are some small touchscreen mini games along the way, and they're not that great. They're pretty short, so it's nothing too much to fuss about though. I also love how they mix low poly 3D in the distance with 2D pixel art for the platforms and characters. One thing I really don't like is that you take damage when doing heavy attacks, nice. I want to be able to combo stuff together, but I just gotta stick to the default light combo to not die too fast. It seems the heavy attacks are more like insta-kill moves, which is an interesting choice, but I wish they were just regular heavy attacks. That would breathe more life into the combat. This game also has vehicle sections where you fly around shooting things up, and they're totally decent, but they don't move as smoothly as the previous game on GBA. So just like in the home console versions, I feel that Battle Nexus did a better job with its segments than Mutant Nightmare did. I kinda like this game more than the home console version, but I don't think it's amazing. It's solid, kinda repetitive, but decently fun. I'd say check it out if you're interested. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Melee. This game actually released before Mutant Nightmare, but I felt like it made more sense to talk about that trilogy in one go. There's no handheld port this time. In PAL regions, we only got this game on the PS2, which is a shame. That means no 4-player action for us, but the other releases did have 4-player modes. Let's try out the adventure mode. You start out with a limited amount of characters, but there's a total roster of 22 characters in this game, which is pretty big. The cell shading looks really nice, but it seems the characters are lower poly, and the turtles have this constant furious expression. I don't think it suits them all that well. Maybe Raph, but not the others. I wish they all had unique facial expressions, but that's just me being very nitpicky. So in this game you got light and heavy attacks and a lot of different combos, as well as blocks, special attacks, and other actions like picking stuff up and throwing them. It feels decently good to play, though it still doesn't feel as good as the first game we talked about. That one really had some smooth and responsive combat. This combat feels more empty. One thing I really like is that you can knock enemies into the air and juggle them. I always find that to be really satisfying. For some reason they only let you move in 8 directions, which feels awful on a joystick. So I recommend playing this game with a D-pad. It's just made for that, it seems. I don't know why they did this, but whatever. There's a decent amount of destruction in the environments too, which is great to see, and there's a good variety of stages. This game has a real Power Stone 2 vibe to it, with how the stages can change as they go on, with different environmental factors and threats. It adds a lot to the stage, and it works well here. There's also weapons you can pick up and even guns, which is interesting. So weird to see Leo with a fucking Gatling gun. There's some missions that offer variety, but they're not really interesting. Here's one where we gotta push off bombs before they blow up the platform you're on. It's not very fun. Thankfully it's optional. I feel like everyone's health is too high in adventure mode, so in the long run it becomes a bit of a slog since each fight lasts longer than I'd like. I wish they made it so regular foot soldiers could be knocked out in just a few hits, while the bosses would be more like proper fights. Make it feel more like a beat 'em up. Taking down one normal foot soldier takes like 20 or 30 seconds straight of punches and kicks to each one. It just goes on forever. The bosses do have more health, but I just wish the goons were easier to knock out. Jumping into melee mode, you have 3 different game modes. King of the Hill, where you try to stay within a specific space for as long as possible to score points. Keep Away, where you grab a treasure and hold it until you get enough points to win. And melee matches, where you can play either based on trying to get a certain amount of knockouts or just be the last man standing. You can only be 4 players at a time, so you can't do 1v1s, which I think is a bit of a shame. You also can't split into teams of 2v2. It's always 4 people, everyone against everyone. It should have been easy to implement different amounts of players, and it would add some nice options, make the game more replayable. It's a shame that this game's options are just so restrictive, and I felt that the combat got boring really fast. No dashing, no grabs, limited movement. I'm not a huge fan of this one. It's only okay. There just wasn't much here to keep me interested. The adventure mode is really short, but the missions are all pretty boring to me. The game is fine, there's nothing about it that's really all that bad, but I feel the combat has no weight to it. Everything feels so empty. And considering this game is all about the fights, I'm surprised it's probably the weakest game I've played so far in that regard. It's just a really uninteresting game to me. Before we end this, let's take a quick look at the plug and play games. I got this footage from CC Infinity, which I've linked below. First up, we got Mutants and Monster Mayhem, but all this game is an incredibly basic light gun game where things slide across the screen and you try to shoot them. That's all there is to it. The second game is Battle for the City, where you select one of the 4 turtles to play, and it's a pretty simple platformer beat 'em up, where you also look for certain key items. If you die, you have to play as a different turtle, so you effectively get 4 lives per level. There's also some comic book style cutscenes, and a couple of boss fights. This game seems pretty decent. Hell, for being a plug and play game, it seems to be as good as they'd get around that time, but it's hard to say how it feels without playing it. I know I've been pretty harsh on these games, but the truth is, if I had any of them as a kid, I'd play them non-stop. My favorite game is TMNT 2 Battle Nexus. That game definitely has a few frustrating moments, but it's also the one I had the most fun playing, and it has such a wealth of content. I'd rather take something that can be a bit frustrating but overall more fun compared to something as plain and boring as TMNT 3 Mutant Nightmare. And I also gotta give a shout out to the versus mode from the first game. I know it's silly, but I just really love stuff like that, and it probably had the best combat out of all the games. It's a real shame the first two games were the only ones I really enjoyed. It seemed after that things just got worse. At least the first and third handheld games were pretty neat. If you're a fan of the Turtles and you're itching for some 2003 specific action, well, these are all your choices. It could be worse, it could be better, but regardless, I still had a lot of fun. And if you love this franchise as much as I do, some of these games may still be worth your while, despite their faults. Thank you for watching. Have a good one.